Thank you so much. I want to make sure I have the microphone right. Is that right? Just about? Okay. Well, I certainly want to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me. Turn it down? Okay. Sure. Thanks. I always have height problems with mics. And I'm especially grateful to have been included despite the fact that I actually might be described as part of the problem. And by that I mean the cultural problem that makes a conference like this necessary. Because I'm studying some of the factors that have long made it difficult to devote sufficient attention to Russia's regions. And what I mean by this is that in many other cultural traditions, the importance of regions and regionalism is a given. They exist, they've maybe always existed, and we talk about them. In the Russian tradition, regions and regionalism often struggle for acknowledgement, for attention, for respect. Most notably in literary discourse in Russia, what we usually get in place of regions and regionalism is provinces and provincialism, that is provincia and provincialnost. And the book that I'm working on now tries to make sense of this fact, mostly by looking at 19th century canonical Russian prose. So I really am talking about a discourse that originates in the center and is imaginary. I'm writing about a certain set of images that have often shaped and misshaped how Russian literature represents the nation's geography. So to introduce these images, I'd like to start out by looking at two maps from two different traditions, maps that represent radically different ways of thinking about geographic space. The first one, on this side, closer to me I think, is an 1808 postal map of central Russia. So what do we see? We see Moscow at the center of a web-like system. It's the hub of a wheel with spokes extending out to the perimeter. And the perimeter forms a ring with stations or towns every 20, 30 versts or so. And this arrangement is characteristic of the coach relay system that connected the empire. So if you were actually to take a compass and set the foot in the center of Moscow and then dial rings that were, say, 25, then 50, then 75 kilometers out, you'd probably find a pattern of settlement circles. And in fact, if you look at a road map of Russia today, you'll see more or less the same thing, which is all roads leading back to Moscow. And Petersburg, by contrast, you see is supported by just one road, the one that Radishchev made famous. So what do we learn from the image? Well, first of all, we see how the human geography of settlement around Moscow came to be organized according to a certain communicative logic. And that was a logic that did not aim to settle lands according to a grid. It didn't think in terms of grids. This map also has implications for how Russians have imagined geographic space, because even after technologies of transportation changed, Russian space often continued to be imagined as a series of concentric circles centered on Moscow. So this is a symbolic geography with a middle. And in 19th century discussions of European Russian geography, words like center, middle, heart, nucleus, seed, core, and inner recur constantly. So as one 19th century ethnographer put it, Moscow's absolute centrality was, quote, no accident. It lies at the very center of Rus, in a position so perfectly central that it corresponds to Russia's middle with mathematical precision, unquote. In the words of another writer, the memoirist F.N. Glinka, quote, Moscow is Russia's central sun around which other towns appear like planets. So, of course, the boundaries of this central Russia were redrawn many times as the shape and extent of the empire changed, but the idea that Russia has a middle, a space that's both interior and central, this idea was rarely challenged, nor was the assumption that this space was in some way uniquely important. So, in other words, looking at this map, we can see why Mayakovsky taught Soviet school children to say, «Начинается земля, как известно, от Кремля». The earth begins, as is well known, at the Kremlin. Okay, so now let's look at the other map, the one further away from me, and this is something that you're probably familiar with if you went to American secondary school, and that is Thomas Jefferson's 1785 Land Ordinance, a very famous document. And this image represents, first of all, the landmass of North America, but more importantly, it represents a plan for imagining, colonizing, organizing, and finally governing this land. So what's the first thing we notice if we compare it to the Russian map? Well, there's no center. And what does it imply, not to have a center? One thing this implies, I think, is that no particular place is necessarily more important than any other place. So instead of rings, Jefferson's map lays down a mechanical grid over the surface of the continent. It invites us to see the continent as a series of interlocking and essentially interchangeable 6-mile square, Lego-like sections. And each of these sections can be either subdivided so as to yield farms of a certain number of acres, or it can be endlessly extended so as to define the state borders that we still see today when we look at a map of the American Midwest. And here I'd like to draw on an analysis of Jefferson's land ordinance by the American cultural critic Philip Fisher. Fisher writes that the image can be read as an expression of what he calls, quote, Cartesian social space, space that is identical point to point, potentially unlimited in extent, with no clear logic of limitation. In this kind of space, the kind that's imagined by a grid, all parts are in essence identical, and therefore, as Fisher notes, any part can stand for or represent the whole. So what this means is that in theory, Kansas City, Missouri, or Fresno, California, or Denver, Colorado, any of those has the same claim to meaningfulness and representativeness as does New York or Los Angeles or Boston. And I actually first started thinking about this during, I guess it was the 2008 presidential campaign, when Sarah Palin said that Wasilla, Alaska was a microcosm of the United States. And I thought that's extremely bizarre. It's not a microcosm of the United States, and what is the kind of symbolic imaginary that makes it possible to make that claim? And I think that the grid starts to answer that question a little bit. So in this ideal vision, America's democratic social space was supposed to be, as Fisher says, a universal and everywhere similar medium in which rights and opportunities are identical. So obviously, you can't get much further from America's relentlessly equalizing grid than Russia's series of concentric circles radiating out from a single focal point. The important thing, though, isn't the obvious contrast, but rather what this suggests for how meaning inheres, or how meaning does not inhere, in geographic space. So the main question I want to ask now is, in the Russian map, what happens in semiotic terms as you move away from the center of the circle? And I would argue that in general, as you move out from the center, meaning is diluted, coherence fades, and entropy prevails. So the further you get from the center in this imaginary system, the more things fall apart. Because the center is what provides the ordering power that's necessary for meaningfulness and coherence. And this explains why a Russian historian could write in 1901, quote, in order to understand any of Russia's peripheral regions, one has to understand this seed that gave rise to Russian strength and vitality that then spread outward to the borderlands. So what this statement suggests is that even as the center of Russia was seen as the vital source of all energy and innovation, this kind of seed, kernel, it was also thought kind of vaguely to be under threat. It was dangerously vulnerable to the diffusing, squandering, entropic effects of all the surrounding supposedly empty space. As early as the 18th century, people feared that interior Russia was in decline because somehow it was being drained of power by these burgeoning peripheries. And these worries intensified along with imperial expansion, reaching an apogee possibly in the early 20th century. So in Gorky's words, for example, Russia's dull vastness threatens to, quote, suck in all cultural achievement. Or, as Berdyaev put it, the center was ever at risk of, quote, sinking into the fog of the deep provinces. Okay, so now that we've looked at the maps, I want to use them to think about, first of all, a very strange passage in a pretty well-known Chekhov story. And second, after that, some distortions that we encounter over and over in the way that literature represents the nation space. So first, Chekhov. In an 1899 story called "По делам службы," which is usually translated as "on official business," but sometimes in other ways. So there's this young government official, his name is Lizhin. He's originally from Moscow, but he's been assigned to serve in an unspecified Russian province. And this official is then sent out to an even more remote provincial place because he's charged with investigating the unexplained suicide of another official. So he finds himself in a miserable village, which is given a name, Sirnya, but no location. And there he's forced to spend hours alone in a dark hut, alone with the suicide's corpse, with a blizzard raging outside. But as he keeps saying, he's not afraid. And the reason he's not afraid is that nothing here is meaningful enough to be frightening. Chekhov's bureaucrat muses, quote, "If this person had killed himself in Moscow or someplace near Moscow, then it would have been interesting, important, even frightening. But here, 1,000 versts from Moscow, all this was somehow seen in a different light. All this was not life, not real people. It would leave not the least trace in the memory, and it would be forgotten as soon as he departed," unquote. So he thinks to himself that everything in this remote place is, quote, "alien, trivial, and uninteresting." In his estimation, what's wrong with the provinces is that things here don't mean anything. Quote, "Everything here is accidental, случайно. There can be no conclusion drawn from it," unquote. So over and over, he returns to the thought that, quote, "Here there's no life, but just bits of life, fragments. Everything here is accidental, случайно." So he longs for what he calls the cultural center, quote, "a place where nothing is accidental, where everything is in accordance with reason and law, where every suicide is comprehensible, and one can explain why it is and what significance it has in the general scheme of things," unquote. So this is very weird. What strikes Chekhov's Moscow bureaucrat as most painful about this hideous event that he's investigating is precisely its distance from the center. It's this distance that renders phenomena unbearably trivial. So what he finds intolerable is not the suicide, the intractable poverty, the filthy hut, the snowstorm, or the pervasive injustice. It is rather the fact that this backwater has no power to confer significance on any of it. The way he sees it, the meaninglessness of anything that might happen in this place is an inevitable consequence of the place itself. And that's because, according to the schema that's implied in Chekhov's story, only phenomena that fall within range of the capital's ordering powers, even some random suicide, only these phenomena will be rendered legible and significant. So I think that what this very short story is doing is both actually reproducing and critiquing a pattern of representation that we often find in Russian literature's depiction of the nation's physical space. This system assumes that what happens in the center, in Stolitsa, is meaningful. What happens outside the center, in Provincia, is meaningless. But what is really strange is that in literature, the system we see imagined in Chekhov's story holds not just for Moscow, but also for the other capital, for Petersburg. And this despite the fact that Petersburg is, of course, not located in the geographic center of the nation, far from it. As Lotman put it, Petersburg is the kind of capital that's situated at the very edge of the nation's cultural space. And yet, ever since its founding in 1703, Petersburg has proven equally capable of functioning as a center. And this, I think, is why Chekhov's character in "По делам службы" actually conflates Moscow and Petersburg at one point. He thinks to himself in another very strange passage, quote, "Our homeland, the real Russia, is Moscow and Petersburg. Here is just the provinces, the colonies. Родина, настоящая Россия, это Москва, Петербург, а здесь провинция, колония." So Moscow and Petersburg. As this phrase suggests, in many works of literature, the two capitals play virtually identical roles, despite the obvious differences in what each city stands for. So, for example, in Three Sisters, when Chekhov's Prozorovs stand on their provincial porch and say v Moskvu, what they're doing is virtually identical to what Gogol's provincials are doing in the Inspector General when they direct their gaze longingly toward Petersburg. Everybody is dreaming about the capital's signifying power. For Chekhov's characters, as for Gogol's, the capital, any capital, is a quasi-magical and patently unreal ideal toward which provincials look in the hopes that their insignificant lives will take on meaning when subjected to the center's ordering logos. So we see that the doubling of real-life capitals didn't really disrupt the culture's powerful center-periphery binary. In fact, having two competing centers seems to have rendered the capital-province opposition even more powerful. Similarly, the existence of non-Russian and semi-Russian places at the edges of the contiguous empire. So I'm talking about places like Siberia, Ukraine, the Caucasus, even at certain points the steppes. These places did not disrupt the dualistic province-capital opposition that prevails in literary texts either. And I should emphasize that in the cultural imaginary, the empire's various borderlands and frontiers didn't figure as provincia. They were instead something different. These truly peripheral places were generally seen as being opposed to Russia proper. And as such, they often provided writers with material for the kind of local detail and typicality that we usually associate with regionalist writing in other traditions. In fact, having all of these less than Russian spaces within the territorially unified empire might even have intensified the tendency to collapse the heterogeneous regions of European or Central Russia into the idea of the provinces. So the existence of these exotic but accessible outer regions didn't prevent people from seeing Russia proper as being divided between the capitals and the provinces. And the provinces just got imagined simply as the not capital, a mass of grimly uniform places in opposition to which the capitals could take on special meaning. And I want to pause again and emphasize that I'm definitely talking about an imaginary system. I'm not talking about real life. So as Chekhov's story suggests in symbolic terms, part of what both Moscow and Petersburg have served to do is simply diminish the significance of all Russian space that lies outside of them, rendering these various and heterogeneous places mere provincia. Another way to say it would be that the overdetermined insignificance of provincia is what allows the capital, any capital, to take on such significance. Like, quote, black people in America, whose blackness has served to render others white, the meaninglessness of provincia might actually make possible the meaningfulness of the capital. So the Kremlin, at the center of our circle, the Kremlin is, of course, one key incarnation of centralness. In Soviet times, power had come to seem so perfectly concentrated there that, in Emily Johnson's words, quote, everything outside the Kremlin walls appeared almost equally a part of the periphery. But in fact, as we've seen, the actual physical location of a center matters little once you find yourself in a non-exotic, non-borderland Russian space outside of the capitals. What's important is the opposition itself, stolice provincia. So this is why, again, Petersburg is able to function as a center from its very inception, despite its location on the geographic periphery. What this also suggests is that in Russia, you could think of the center as being portable. So as Mikhail Epstein has written, quote, in Russian history, even the capital itself could be transformed into a province, inasmuch as the sovereign would transfer his seat to a specially created or minimally populated center. So this is what happened, of course, with the founding of Petersburg. In such situations, Epstein continues, quote, the center would lose its geographic incarnation, unquote. And these geographic transfers of power serve to provincialize, as Epstein puts it, the entire world that had been abandoned, torn away from the capital throne, unquote. So this is why at certain points in Russian history, Moscow and Petersburg themselves could be figured as provincial. And again, the fact that the center is portable and therefore in some sense illusory doesn't make it any less important. The stolitsa, wherever it is or is not, will always stand as an elusive, unreachable ideal. It's a standard against which other places will be judged and always found wanting. This, I think, helps explain why one of the most important tropes in Russian literature is the wretched and anonymous provincial town, usually called just Город N. So from Gogol to Dobitchin and beyond, we encounter these imaginary places, which are at once repulsively alien and intimately familiar. In fact, the provinces versus capital binary proved so powerful that even authors who contested it, and there were, of course, many authors who contested it, Tolstoy, Leskov, many women writers, but even they were still obligated to engage with the all too familiar image of a stagnant, homogeneous provincia. And I think that even today we're so used to the image that we may fail to recognize how puzzling it really should be. What's also puzzling is that this image, this kind of Gorod N place, hardly changes at all over the course of a century and a half. So Gogol, Herzen, Turgenev, Goncharov, Khoshinskaya, Dostoevsky, Chekhov, both Sologovs, Dabuichin, and I could go on, all reprised the dead-in-life provincial town, a place that's distinguished only by its indistinguishability from other provincial towns. That is, even though Russian society underwent truly radical changes in the years that my work looks at, which is roughly 1830 to 1917, or maybe up to 1930, Provincia continued to be depicted in almost identical terms, as if changes as momentous as the end of serfdom, the rise of a market economy, revolutions in transportation and literacy, the gentry's decline, et cetera, as if all of this was powerless to affect Russia's provincial core. Provincia never changes because it's imagined as being fundamentally ahistorical. And that's why Bakhtin describes provincial places in literature as eventless. They're places that are mired in what he calls, quote, a viscous and sticky time that drags itself slowly through space, unquote. So at this point, I want to make sure that I've been clear about what exactly I'm talking about or where exactly I'm talking about when I talk about the provinces and provincialism. The label provincial does not refer to rural life, and only sometimes does it refer to the life of the gentry estate, as I'll discuss in a moment. Rural life is the village, that's dеревня, деревенский, whereas provincialny, or in Gogol gubernsky, this generally refers to provincial cities and towns, and sometimes to gentry estates that have failed to attain to a certain civilizovanность. So provincia is not linked with nature in any consistent way, and above all, peasants are never provincials, and peasant culture is not provincial culture. And that's because peasants are not trying and failing to follow the mode of the capital. They're simply not implicated in the semiotic system that Franco Moretti has described as, quote, fashion, this great metropolitan idea, this engine that never stops and makes the provinces feel old and ugly and jealous and seduces them forever and a day. So what marks provincials, but not peasants, is a fatal lack of ease and naturalness, this kind of trying too hard that becomes the subject of so much mockery in 19th century literature. Whereas peasants are not speaking bad French, and they're not boasting of their very local high society. Peasants are associated with a folk authenticity, and it's precisely authenticity to which the provincial sphere has no legitimate claim from the point of view of the center. So to be provincial is to be behind. You can only be behind if you inhabit a social world that believes in progress, fashion, the march of enlightenment, things like that. This is what marks provinciality as a modern phenomenon, bound up not only with modern forms of government, like centralized control, but also with modern forms of consumption, like ever-changing fashion, economic exchange, entertainment, artistic trends, etc. Provincials are, above all, imitators, always trying to catch up. Thus, the story of Russia's anxiety about provinciality is the story of its desire to be modern and Western, two terms that have often been taken to mean the same thing. So what then about gentry estates? Is an estate or was an estate provincial in this sense? I think that an estate, regardless of its location, could be either deeply provincial, that is, in the sense of culturally isolated and marked by inept imitation, or it could be not provincial at all. So obviously the states in Gogol's Dead Souls, where culture exists as a kind of detritus of some far-off civilization, these are the epitome of provinciality, and they occupy the same symbolic space as Dead Souls' Gorod N. But in Fathers and Sons and Anna Karenina, while the Kirsanovs and Lyovin's estates are not lavish, they do exactly what such places were supposed to do. That is, they produce their own version of elite culture, effortless, natural, which basically mirrors or sometimes complements the culture of the capital. So this is why, for example, in Fett's 1856 poema Two Lindens, Dwie Lipki, the facade of a patriarchal manor house on a very remote estate is said to exemplify столичный вкус. Вкус был на манер столичный, во всем фасаде сохранен отличный. So successfully achieved country estates, like the ones we often encounter in Tolstoy and Turgenev, they did what British country houses were thought to do. That is, they served as what one historian of Britain has called, quote, the image of true civilization and social cultivation in the countryside, unquote. So here I would point to the title of a magazine in late 19th century Russia, sort of like Our Better Homes and Gardens. The magazine was called Stolitsa и Усадьба. It was definitely not called Stolitsa и Provincia, right? Because Stolitsa and Усадьба, there was a sort of equivalence there. So in real life, just to say a little bit more about gentry estates, because they're complicated in this system, in real life, as in literature, estates that lived up to the standard of stolichness could be experienced as oases of genuine culture in a provincial wasteland. So, for example, in Prince Dolgorukov's wonderful memoir of his travels in the early 19th century, the prince's relief is palpable whenever he arrives at a well-ordered gentry home, complete with park, music, and library. By contrast, what horrified him and many others was what they saw as the stunted and distorted culture of provincial towns. So Dolgorukov writes, quote, "Torzhok after Petersburg is like a dark night after a bright fine day," unquote. And he has these amazing passages where he transcribes the garbled French in the menus of provincial cities' hotels, for example. And he's just kind of fascinated and repulsed at the same time. He sort of can't stop looking at these menus. Or to take another example from real life, a huge estate like the Sheremetyevs, complete with its own opera company, obviously not provincial, because it was successfully and self-confidently reproducing the culture of the capital. However, it was precisely this aspiration to civilizovanность that left estates vulnerable to degenerating into authenticity and incoherence. If the goal of a sophisticated, ordered, and culturally coherent microcosm was not achieved, then the space could very quickly dissolve into semiotic disarray and second-rate imitation, otherwise known as provinciality. And these are these provincial states that are represented very often in 19th century literature, where you have a very odd collection of objects next to each other, and no one can figure out why they're there or what they mean. They're deprived of all context. Okay, so far I've been speaking mostly about the symbolic weight that provincial places have been made to bear in Russian high culture, especially in the high literary canon. And so I've been talking about the center's gaze on the non-exotic near periphery that this gaze defines as the provinces. This gaze is never neutral, and it's often grotesquely deforming. And of course, as we've all been discussing for 2 days now, people outside the capitals tried very hard to correct the center's various misrepresentations. Geographers, ethnographers, statesmen, military strategists, journalists, all were working to counter received ideas about provincial homogeneity and monotony, and to create categories of localness around which real-world regional identities could take shape. And to a degree, as scholarly work by many people here has demonstrated, local actors' insistence on regional specificity successfully challenged the view of, in Susan Smith-Peters' words, quote, "the local as inert, passive, awaiting the dynamism of the outside," unquote. But what my work emphasizes is that it's always an uphill battle. For one thing, the choice to focus exclusively on the local can be taken as reflecting a kind of implicit acceptance of the capital's intellectual dominance, since it assumes that, say, краеведение's best shot at respect involves deferentially abstaining from participation in capital-centered discourses of national history. In fact, by limiting their focus to the strictly local, 19th century proponents of regional history risked being positioned as objects rather than as subjects. They could come to be seen as providers of historical raw material that would reveal its value only after having been intellectually processed, that is, placed in relation to larger systems of knowledge by scholars in the center. And this is exactly what happens to writers who are labeled as regionalists. So, for example, Melnikov-Pechersky. All the criticism about Melnikov-Pechersky is about how wonderful he is as a source, as raw material, right? And then you're supposed to take that raw material and do something with it from your central position. So I'll give one example of this dynamic, and Catherine Yevtukhova has actually written about this exchange in the 18th century, in the 1870s. Two journalists, one based in Petersburg and one in Nizhny Novgorod, clashed in print about what role the provincial press should play in the life of the nation. And the Petersburg journalist, who I think had been from Nizhny Novgorod before, he insisted that the regional press should always remain clearly subordinate to the press of the capitals, because the only legitimate function of provincial writers was, quote, to gather material for those in the center, because those in the center were, he said, quote, more refined. And anyway, he wrote, everything the provincial press did was, quote, archaeological, sepulchral, dry as dust, unquote. So I'm using dry as dust to render grabokopatelnoye, which literally means grave digging. So this claim implies that the best provincials can do is dig up dead artifacts, which later might, or might not, be reanimated by the life-giving powers of the capitals. And given that this word was often used in the 19th century in association with archaeology, the passage manages to hint that the provinces are virtually a graveyard, with little value beyond the archaeological. They're a site of artifacts that are always already dead and buried. The Nizhny Novgorod journalist and champion of the local press retorted. First, he said that such Peterburgstva recalled the behavior of an ungrateful child toward his long-suffering mother, that mother being provincia. And he went on to note the obvious importance of local knowledge for the locals, of course. But then he went a bit further than this modest kind of for us, by us approach. He noted, quote, alongside the rule of centralization, there is also the rule of decentralization, unquote. He insisted that the provincial press had what he called its own real base, and therefore it had the right, quote, to its own opinion, not only about provincial oblastnim matters, but also about matters of state. So here we see a dignified insistence on the region's right to a voice in national matters. Finally, he plays what we might call the authenticity card. He writes, quote, I prefer the patois of our local press to the fancy language of a publiciste centraliste who is without any sincere conviction. So in the end, of course, the issue remained unresolved, but obviously the fact that it was being debated at all suggests that in journalism and historiography, this kind of regionalist thinking was able to establish some degree of legitimacy. But again, it was an uphill battle. And certainly in literature, regionalism was to remain underdeveloped. And that really should strike us as surprising, given European Russia's many local subcultures. So if we compare Russian literature's representation of the nation's geography with that of, say, British literature, this underdevelopment becomes conspicuous. Russian writers insist above all on the blankness of provincial places. English writers, by contrast, spent much of the 19th century imagining a detailed picture of the British Isles, a rich symbolic geography of the nation that encompassed not only London, but also Jane Austen's estates in their various specific counties, the Bronte sisters' North Yorkshire moors, Walter Scott's Highlands, Dickens' suburban retreats, and so on. As Edward Said writes, these texts developed, quote, a picture of England, socially, politically, morally charted and differentiated in immensely fine detail, in which all of the nation's space was surveyed, evaluated, made known, unquote. I realize that there are exceptions to this. However, by and large, this is not what high Russian literature was doing. It was not especially engaged in imagining European Russia's regions in their distinctiveness and particularity. Whereas in Jane Austen's Mansfield Park, we have the gritty specificity of Portsmouth, shipping economy, naval jargon. In Dead Souls, we have an anonymous Gorod N, a place defined by what it lacks. And another example would be if you think about the development of American literature in the 19th century, every sort of high canon American writer of the 19th century is first a regionalist, right? There's no shame in being a regionalist. You can't be identified with one center. So one result of this pattern in Russia is that in semiotic terms, in the high canon, the difference between something that happens in Ryazan and something that happens in Tver is likely to be minimal. simply because the differences between Russia's regions are dwarfed by the difference between capital and province. Whereas, again, if you look at the American tradition, something that happens in Maine means something very different from something that happens in Nebraska in 19th century literature. So, as a formalist critic would no doubt emphasize, to some degree the literary trope of a blank and homogeneous provincia was living its own life, oblivious to what was actually happening in real-life provincial places. But there were also non-literary historical causes that contributed to this development, and now is not the time to rehearse all of them, but I can quickly list a few that you probably are already aware of. The intensely centralized nature of the Russian state, which encouraged elites to look toward the capital rather than developing strong local affiliations. The fact that the richest, most sophisticated nobles were often absentee landlords who owned multiple estates. And even Catherine's reforms, which aimed to standardize the appearance of all provincial cities. There were very specific rules. I don't know that they were always followed, but there were very specific rules about what provincial buildings were supposed to look like. All this helps explain why Russian literature, in place of regionalism, gives us the trope of provincial equivalence. As Sologub puts it in a story from the 1840s, all our provincial towns look the same. If you've seen one, you've seen them all. Everything the same, the same, the same. And this idea was reiterated constantly by writers from Gogol through Chekhov and beyond. Though, as usual, Dead Souls makes the point most extravagantly. Gogol attributes almost no trait to his town of N that he does not also attribute to, quote, all provincial towns. So in conclusion, I would just note one thing that becomes clear when we analyze this Russian discourse on provincia, and that is that provinciality represents a more serious threat to a positive view of Russianness than it does, say, to Frenchness or Englishness or Americanness. So in French literature, disdain for things provincial, the world outside of Paris, is not accompanied by any particular anxiety. And once you make it to Paris, you might fail or you might be disillusioned, like in Balzac's Lost Illusions. But you always stand a real chance of freeing yourself from provincial taint. And no matter what happens to you, what's really important is that Paris itself will forever remain as the true, the undeniably central metropolis, in Walter Benjamin's formulation, the capital of the 19th century, and a very real standard to which you might attain. Consequently, it seems that France, despite its extremely strong tradition of centralization and top-down culture, finds the provincial to be distasteful and worthy of contempt, but not really threatening. In Russia, unlike in France, provincialism is deeply worrisome because the provinciality of the provinces can be seen to reflect the provinciality, maybe even the inauthenticity, of the entire nation. The Russian capitals, always trying to catch up to and imitate the West, might be no less provincial than the provinces in comparison to the real center, out there, somewhere, maybe in Europe, maybe imaginary. Given this anxiety, the worry that the relationship between capital and province might just recapitulate the relationship between Europe and Russia, I would argue that provincia assumed its role in Russia's cultural imaginary less because of its own intrinsic qualities than because of Russia's conception of itself as a whole. The provinces can provoke horror and revulsion not because they're different from the capitals, but because they might be the same, peripheral, backward, imitative, inauthentic. As a result, writing about provincia becomes a way of interrogating Russian identity itself. Thank you.